Hi everyone, this is Frank with Teachly University, and in this discussion today, in this lecture, we're going to be discussing and really Carl Jung and diving in more into the concept of synchronicity. And I created a previous video or several videos of Carl Jung and discussing synchronicity and how thoughts become things. And this is a term we've heard in the personal growth space, especially as it relates to the law of attraction and really how really our minds and really our internal workings of how our mind operates can influence in some way our external environment. And that's something that we're going to be exploring here. So I want to start again with a quote from Jung, who says, "It may seem that my discussion of synchronicity has led me away from my main theme, but I feel it is necessary to make at least a brief introductory reference to it because it is a Jungian hypothesis that seems to be pregnant with future possibilities of investigation and application. Synchronistic events, moreover, almost invariably accompany the crucial phases of the process of individuation, but too often they pass unnoticed because the individual has not learned to watch for such coincidences and to make them meaningful in relation to the symbolism of his dreams." So when it comes to synchronicity and the idea of how our thoughts can influence our external environment, or how when we experience chance occurrences, opportunities, new experiences that seem to come out of nowhere, is it possible that it relates to statistics or probability? That it just happens to be a specific probable chance that this event occurred, or that you met this person, or had this experience? Or is there something more to it than that? That perhaps maybe whether we realize it or not, whether we consciously or unconsciously are aware of it, that our thoughts can influence our external environment in some way. And that really, this is a very subjective individual process. Again, the process of individuation, where this is a very subjective experience, where many of us go throughout the day where we're totally unconscious of these experiences and how perhaps maybe our thoughts influences our external environment in some way, but that it goes unnoticed to most of us, or it goes underneath our awareness because most of us are on autopilot, because as I've mentioned, that the vast majority of our behaviors are totally unconscious. So then to recognize and to experiment with a synchronicity, it requires then that we become self-aware of our thoughts and how they relate to our external environment, how our thoughts can perhaps influence certain outcomes in our personal lives. So Jung says that we often dream about people from whom we receive a letter by the next post. I have ascertained on several occasions that at the moment when the dream occurred, the letter was already lying in the post office of the addressee, referring to an example of synchronicity. Synchronicity then is a coming together of inner and outer events in a way that cannot be explained by cause and effect, and that is meaningful to the observer. So there's two worlds. There's the external world, the external environment that we live in, the material world that we experience every day. And then there's the internal world, the world within our own minds, or the mental studio, as I call it. And these worlds, at least many will argue, are independent from one another. So what happens in our external environment is totally outside of our control. Many of our circumstances and events that occur are outside of our control. And there's a lot of truth to this because we can't control everything in our external environment. And then we have our internal world that's also independent of the material world. But then what Jung is saying, I think what more even physicists and other authors that study this space argue, is that really these two worlds are one in a way, that what we think about internally, our thoughts and our behaviors and our feelings, can influence our external reality in some way, where what we think about or what we become is what we think about, as Earl Nightingale says, or what we choose to focus on becomes our experience in everyday life, and how our perceptions can shape our reality. And that by changing our perceptions, then, we can begin influencing change in our outer world without necessarily exerting so much effort. And I think that's what's so appealing about synchronicity, is that we can change our environment without exerting so much effort, without feeling like we have to try so hard to achieve a desired outcome, whatever that may be. That is what's appealing about it. But it also could be detrimental to studying synchronicity, because it It gives off the idea that you don't have to do anything to achieve something. There is some effort required. But a lot of that effort goes to focusing on our internal mind and focusing on a desirable vision and focusing on becoming the person that we want to be. And once again, referring to Abraham Maslow and looking at the pinnacle of the hierarchy of needs is by becoming our authentic self. And by becoming our authentic self, then we can enter these states of flow where we're immersed in the present moment. And by entering these states more often, then perhaps we can channel this energy within ourselves and outside of us, where we can experience more of these synchronistic events. So we must remember that the rationalistic attitude of the West is not the only possible one and is not all embracing, but is in many ways a prejudice and a bias that ought perhaps to be corrected. So what Jung is saying here in his book Synchronicity is that there's more than one way to look at life. There's certainly the Western way of looking at things, which is more linear, more cause and effect, of trying to predict a particular outcome, and can be in some ways secular to a degree, not always, but in some ways. But then there's other ways of looking at things where there's more to life than what we see at face value, that there's the world of the unseen, the world that is within our own minds, and this energy, this universal intelligence that exists, that at least how many physicists are beginning to argue that when you examine our universe and the creation of the universe, especially just referring to the Big Bang, and when you examine it very closely, when you examine our natural world and the universe as a whole, you begin to see then that it raises some questions as to whether or not there is an intelligence behind the creation of the universe. And that with this creation, with this intelligence then, it leads us to realize that there's more than one way to look at things. There's more than one way to look at life and how to perceive yourself in the world around you and how to overcome the challenges that we face. Again, that there's more than one way to look at things, and that's worth exploring. So then there is no rule that is true under all circumstances, for this is the real and not a statistical world. Because the statistical method shows only the average aspects. It creates an artificial and predominantly conceptual picture of reality. So what Jung is saying here is that we focus more on probability and statistics, where there's the rational way of looking at the world. And certainly rational thinking and statistical thinking is important in terms of trying to predict an outcome, trying to predict circumstances, and trying to use being rational and facing reality for what it is. But then there's also the world of the unseen, or the irrational, where on a subjective level, the way we experience the world goes beyond statistics. That it is our own perceptions, our own free will, our own vision and energy that we channel in the world that can influence our personal reality. And thus that shapes our personality as well. So statistics plays a role, obviously. But there's a lot more to life than simply just being materialistic or focusing on probability alone. And I think this is a great quote to follow up on that. So natural laws are statistical truths, which means that they are completely valid only when we are dealing with macro physical quantities. In the realm of very small quantities, prediction becomes uncertain, if not impossible, because very small quantities no longer behave in accordance with the known natural laws. So as I said before earlier in the lecture, that experiencing synchronistic events is a very subjective experience, where it's a very individual experience for that matter. And this is something you have to explore within yourself. So certainly statistics is much more relevant in macro physical quantities, meaning that statistics make sense, or probability and rational thinking makes sense when trying to predict outcomes, whether it's you're trying to send a rocket to the moon or trying to engineer and build ships and cars or other items or technology, or in other fields. Certainly statistics and the rational thinking is important, but then there's the irrational, where you may have an idea for something, but there's nothing in your external environment to validate that what you want is possible, but that doesn't mean that it cannot happen. And that's where statistics no longer applies, because there's nothing to validate that what you want is possible. But yet by focusing then, by feeling, as Neville Goddard says, feeling as if the wish is fulfilled, by channeling this energy and reshifting our focus, and by entering these states of flow where we're so immersed in the present moment, where we are immersed in the person that we want to become, that's when I think things begin to happen. And through our actions and behaviors and thoughts, we can influence our reality and have much more control of it. We can't control everything, of course, but at the very minimum, we can control our perception of it. And this is a very subjective experience. So this is a quote from Michael Talbot's book, The Holographic Universe. I thought this is really suitable, I think, or relevant for this lecture, where he says that when Jung first advanced this idea of synchronicity, most physicists did not take it seriously, although one eminent physicist of the time, Wolfgang Pauli, felt it was important enough to co-author a book with Jung on the subject entitled The Interpretation and Nature of the Psyche. But now that the existence of non-local connections has been established, some physicists are giving Jung's idea another look. Physicist Paul Davies states these non-local quantum effects are indeed a form of synchronicity in the sense that they establish a connection, more precisely a correlation, between events for which any form of causal linkage is forbidden. So when we look at the field of quantum physics, which is a field right now that has grown in popularity in recent years, physicists have continued to revisit Jung's study of synchronicity because the more we study quantum physics, where what we observe can somehow influence the external environment in some way, that there's a cause and effect or correlation between events, there is a causal linkage involved, then we begin to see that there's more to life than what we see at face value, as I said before, that there seems to be some sort of connection between our thoughts and observations and the world around us, and that perhaps our perceptions of the world and of ourselves are faulty at best. And more likely they are, because if to dive a little bit into psychology, most of us have developed self-limiting beliefs dating back since we were children. All of us have experienced some sort of trauma. So unfortunately, it's this trauma and negative experiences that have warped our perceptions in some way. That prevents us from really seeing reality for what it is, that perhaps maybe we have much more control and influence of what happens to us than what we realize. And I think certainly even in the world of physics, that there's some argument of truth or some level of truth to that. Especially with even examining, as I said before, the nature of our universe, then when you really look into our universe and its creation, you can't help but come to the conclusion that perhaps there is some sort of intelligence behind it. And that perhaps it's wise to use this intelligence in some way to our advantage and to better our lives in the world. So Jung says that in addition to his observations, actually this is from Tammy L. Montgomery, The Nature and Enunciation and Synchronicity, very good book. In addition to his observations about time and synchronicity, Jung observed that synchronistic events often occur during heightened emotionally charged situations. Every emotional state produces an alteration of consciousness, a certain narrowing of consciousness and a corresponding strengthening of the unconscious. He referred to this process as compensation. Jung hypothesized that highly charged conscious states lead to a psychic override to varying degrees of the constrictions of time and space temporarily, altering mechanistic principles and giving way to underlying patterns of meaning. So this, by reading this quote, it reminds me of, again, Neville Goddard's work, Feeling is the Secret. When you focus on something with such emotion or such intentional emotion, and when you focus your consciousness and your awareness on what it is that you desire, by feeling as if what you want is already in the present moment, according to Jung, and even some physicists in the field of quantum mechanics and quantum physics, that somehow this process called compensation constricts time and space temporarily. And I think this could be describing when we're entering states of flow, where we're no longer worried about time and space or where we are. We're not thinking about the past or worrying about the future. We are in the present moment. Hence the constriction of time and space temporarily. So what that really means is that we're in these states of flow. When we are in flow and we're not worried about outcomes, we're not self-conscious about ourselves or worried about what's happening outside of us, and when we're in the moment, we're in the zone, that's when things somehow begin to happen. And that is why, and I refer to Stephen Kotler and his work, The Rise of Superman, where in interviewing many high-level athletes, these athletes argue when they enter these states of flow, they feel superhuman, they feel godlike, where they're so in the zone and feeling almost invincible because they're in these positively charged emotional states where nothing seems to matter. They're just in the moment. And that is the moments that we want to engage in much more often or have much more often. Because as Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi says, that these are the forms of, this is the optimal way of living or of human experience when we're entering these states much more often. And when we enter these states of flow, according to Jung at least, we can temporarily remove ourselves from space and time. And that's we can really influence not just our bodies, but perhaps our circumstances, where we truly can become invincible and live life the way we want to. And it's really about consciousness and what we choose to focus on. Whether you subscribe to synchronicity or not, at the very least, in terms of our consciousness and the way we think and what we focus on, what we choose to focus on can impact our reality in either a very positive or negative way. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Make sure to hit that subscribe button where you can watch all my lectures on personal growth, wealth building, creativity, entrepreneurship. Thank you so much and have a great day.